Let's bring it back to something very real. That is your stance on performance-enhancing drugs in sport. You've made a big noise around the world saying that you believe it is right to allow athletes, allow cyclists to use performance-enhancing drugs, even though many of those very same athletes say it's absolutely not the way they want their sport to go. So why?
Well, the rules of sport are entirely arbitrary. They're what we make them. So there's no inherent rightness or wrongness of any set of rules. You choose them according to various values. And one of them is their ability to be enforced, their ability to protect athletes' health, the ability to create a fair playing field that's enforceable. Now, the current regime involves today, what athletes are actually doing today is not what the East Germans did in the 70s of taking massive doses of drugs that turn women into men. They're moving within the natural range for all of these parameters like blood, testosterone, growth hormone, and it's virtually impossible to detect whether someone is moving within this normal range. And it's safe because they're in the normal range.
But
the only reason that we have...
If you persist with this, you turn sport into a contest between scientists rather than a contest between physical athletes.
Well, of course...
Because the best drugs will win.
Of course you could if you, again, moved into super-normal doses of these things.
You seem to miss a sort of human element here. Let me just quote your words from Bradley Wiggins, Tour de France winner, a guy who has made a stand against drugs, says he's never used drugs in a sport which has been tainted by drugs. He says, I do what I do because I love it. I don't do it for a power trip. What I love is doing my best and working my hardest. If I felt I had to take drugs in my sport, I would quit tomorrow.
Well, again, they do take substances that enhance their performance. Caffeine used to be banned. It's not a naturally occurring substance in the body. It's now permitted. It increases the time...
But there's a difference.
Well, caffeine is a performance... I'll give you some other performance enhancers that athletes take all the time. Analgesics, local anaesthetics, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, to enable them to deal with the pain and damage of competition, to keep... Nearly 100% of footballers are on these sorts of drugs to enable them to perform better. Those things are very unnatural and they're also dangerous. But nobody perceives them to be performance-enhancing drugs. But of course they are. That's why they're given.
Hello everybody. You just saw a YouTube clip from an interview made by BBC with Professor Julian Savulescu of Oxford University, UK. Professor Savulescu published a paper back in 2004 called Why We Should Allow Performance-Enhancing Drugs in Sport, and the title should indicate that he has some specific opinions on this matter. The reason why I am interested in this paper is the simple fact that he refers to one of my papers, Performance-Enhancing Drug Game, published in Journal of Sports Economics slightly earlier the same year, and he uses to some extent my results to argue for his conclusion, which is, as you probably already have understood, related to legalizing drugs in sports. This is definitely not my opinion, and I intend to give some arguments why I really can't see that this is a good idea. These arguments would be mainly economic theoretic, and I claim that Professor Savulescu, actually being a philosopher maybe it's called, should look at the sports economic scene if he really wants to make way with these kind of arguments. Okay, let's start looking at how I see it. Okay, as always, let's look at some necessary background material. This very short paper I wrote just a few years ago is related to the original paper by Savulescu and his co-authors. In order to get the full out of this, I think it's a good idea that the viewer should have a look at this paper. It was published, as I said, in British Journal of Sports Medicine back in 2004, and the title was Why We Should Allow Performance-Enhancing Drugs in Sport. And doing a straightforward Google search should actually give us the title and also the paper. On the top here you see there is something called WWSAPEDIS.something.com, and that is actually the homepage for this journal. So if you click on the top title here, you will actually find the paper itself. So you can just download it and read it. It's freely available. You can click the PDF here to actually get the whole article. As I previously indicated, I really didn't like this paper when it came back in 2004, because I felt that to a certain extent the author kind of used some other work of mine as some of the major building blocks of his arguments. And as I really don't agree with his conclusion, I felt at that point the need to write something back, but unfortunately I didn't find time then. So I did find time later on, and did actually write something which was published not in the journal but at a blog related to the journal. I never heard any reaction from the distinguished Oxford professor himself, of course, but I don't care so much about that. Okay, so you can find my paper by again doing a Google search here, and the only difference in the title is that you just replace should with shouldn't. So my title was why we shouldn't allow performance enhancing drugs in sport. And you see here it is why, no, sorry, maybe I wrote it wrong here. Yeah, I did. Shouldn't, then perhaps we would find it. Yeah, you see it's here, why we shouldn't allow performance enhancing drugs in, and it's at blogs.bmsj. So if you open this one, you will find my answer to the professor in his full view. You can look at it and read it if you like. Okay, let's move to my actual presentation. It's located as it always is, and you find it by doing this one, academia.edu, and my name, and enter the site. And in this case, it's still located under conference presentations on the left side here. And it's the first one, the doping self-report. No, sorry, it's this one. Why we shouldn't allow performance-enhancing drugs in sport. So let's download the presentation, put it up on full screen, and go through it. It was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine blog, and it was published 2 years ago, I seem to recall, in 2012. Okay. The outline is straightforward. We start by looking and examining Savulescu's original arguments, of course with his co-authors. And then we look at my main objection, and we look in more detail into my, should we say, economic arguments, and then a quick conclusion in the end. Savulescu and co-authors argue along two main lines. The first one is that they state that allowing drugs among athletes would lead to a fairer game, more fair play if you like. You can kind of partition this into at least two main partitions. The first one, doping can equate genetic differences. The idea then, of course, is that there are certain sports who, should we say, need special genetic abilities, for instance height or weight or strength or whatever, and by using performance enhancing drugs, or PEDs as I intend to call it from now on, you can probably, at least to some extent, try to do something with this. If you want to play basketball, for instance, it's very hard to be successful unless you're more than 2 meters high. Of course, not everybody are more than 2 meters high, and if you still have a talent for this sport and really want to do it, then of course getting some PED help in increasing your height may kind of give you an opportunity you never would have had. The other point is relating to economic differences. Of course there are rich countries, poor countries. The rich countries have money to do height training, to increase the level of red necessities in your blood. The poor countries don't have that money. Of course they can take EPO instead, and if they're allowed to do that, then of course there will be a more even playing field. Finally, he kind of argues that doping is is in principle not very different from the other things you do here. For instance, a lot of sports people take painkillers today to be able to do their sport. Painkillers, they are of course not natural. They are kind of trying to hide this pain, which is a signal from the body of not doing what you intend to do. But it makes it possible for instance, football players to play a very important match. So there is really nothing from a moral point of view that, at least from Savulescu's point of view, kind of is a difference between using drugs to enhance performance or using drugs to make it possible to perform. And to some extent, I must say, I really agree with him here. I agree that it may be more fair to allow PEDs in sports. His other argument is related to safety. That is, of course, kind of obvious, isn't it? If today athletes are not allowed to use it, of course they will have to do it in disguise. In that sense, it may lead to some unwanted side effects. Experimenting with old, or especially maybe with new drugs, may be very dangerous. The dose you should take is not given. The side effects or other effects is unknown, and so on. So, of course, being able to monitor this process, doing open experiments on it, may definitely lead to a safer environment for athletes who actually try drugs. So, roughly, I must say I agree fully with Savulescu and his co-authors' arguments along this line. Unfortunately, there is a lack in this argumentation. It kind of links to what perhaps is related to ethical or philosophical contexts related to doping, but the economic side has not been discussed at all. And of course, if you read the paper, you will see that this view is not there at all. Okay, so to sum up, all these arguments seem straightforward, with limited controversy. After all, don't we all prefer fair play and increased safety for athletes? Of course we should do that. If we really want to discuss something related to these arguments, this concept of a so-called safe drug, or a drug which is kind of controlled medically, should of course be discussed. I have never heard about any safe drug. All drugs have side effects. Of course, the positive side effects of PEDs is to increase performance, but there is almost always some kind of negative side effects. So Savulescu and his co-authors draws the conclusion: let us define the set of safe drugs, ban all other drugs, and grant everybody free access to the set of safe drugs. That would be fairer and safer. And as I said previously, I agree. So what is my point? As I've already indicated, there is no economic arguments related to this, and frankly, I really think these arguments must be included in order to make a sensible decision here, because this is a very important decision, isn't it? If you kind of get a kind of big decision among all sporting agents that PEDs should be allowed, that may really have consequences. I claim that arguments both on the demand side and especially, as I say, on the supply side, lead to a possible breakdown of professional sports markets. So I kind of look at this from the market point of view. And as such, this would be the best example ever on how to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If the consequence of legalizing PEDs is that there will be no professional sports activity, of course you've solved the problem. There won't be any PEDs in drugs anymore, even if you allow it. But the point is perhaps not to achieve this. To achieve is to kind of have some professional sports, and in that sense this is a very good example on how a baby may be getting out with the bath water. Okay, let's look at my arguments more in detail. Let's start with perhaps the less important part, the demand side. I know 3 points here. The first thing I'm interested in is the uncertainty of outcome. Uncertainty of outcome is an important point in sports markets. If you have a too low uncertainty of outcome, that would mean that most spectators would know who would win the contest, and presumably that would raise some less interest. The other way around, if you're able to do it the other way, increase uncertainty of outcome, leading to a less predictable sporting event, you would expect more people to get interested due to the increased tension, of course. Of course, if you do this to the extreme, have an absolute uncertainty outcome with a 50-50% chance on any athlete winning, it's the same as throwing dice, and that is perhaps not very interesting. So the point here is kind of to balance this uncertainty outcome, not to either extreme, but somewhere in the middle. Given an assumption here that in many sports the uncertainty outcome is too low, then of course the strategy of allowing PEDs could lead to a more even play field and an increasement in uncertainty outcome at large, and as such some kind of demand increase. Of course this is not really easy to say how much, but at least roughly you could say that these could at least lead to an increase in demand. So there is a positive potential for legalizing PEDs when it comes to increasing uncertainty outcome. But mark, it's not necessarily such that increasing the uncertainty outcome leads to maximizing attendance. My second point here is in the other direction. It's related to the spectators or the demanders directly here. Today, when I look at the 100-meter field in the Olympics of runners, I expect that most of them either have used or use some kind of PEDs. If you look at their muscles, it seems suspicious, at least from my point of view. But I still expect, I don't know, and there is a big difference in my opinion between expecting somebody to use drugs and knowing somebody to use drugs. And of course, if you allow PEDs, and given that PEDs really work, then you need to take drugs to be an athlete. You cannot avoid it because given that they really work, you would be too uneven in the competition to be able to succeed. And if you want to win, presumably most athletes would prefer that, then you would just drop out if you don't want to use drugs. So you're kind of ending up with a sample here where everybody takes drugs and everybody at the stands would know that. And the question then kind of occurs, how would that affect the interest or the willingness to pay to be strictly economical from the attendance point of view? My prediction is that it will not have a positive effect. I would expect that less people would be interested in watching sports if they knew that everybody uses drugs. So my conclusion in that case is that demand would go down. Of course, there is no one demand up and one demand down, and the net effect is perhaps hard to predict. I have a final argument here under point 3, which is related to the concept of excellence. Excellence is something more that spectators demand. In sports, of course, they demand a lot more than these two dimensions, but this dimension is important here. Excellence is a relative measure. It says that somebody is so much better than somebody else. And it seems that sports spectators like this excellence. They like 100-meter runners running very fast, typically faster than the rest of the guys. Sometimes they like that the football team really wins with excellence, winning by 5 or 6 to nothing. If you equate by increasing uncertainty outcome, of course this excellence concept is going down, because as it's relative, there will be less very good athletes or football players or whatever. So these effects will lead to a decrease in demand. My final question here is simply related to the fact that, of course, we don't know what the net effect would be. My prediction is that the net effect would be negative. But this is really not my main point. My main point is related to the supply side. So let's look at the supply side. And my main point comes already at point 1 here. Would parents support their children's sporting activities if they knew that PEDs are used? I think this is the most important question to ask. Now we are kind of argued that in a situation with legalized PEDs, if I have a son now and he shows a talent for 100-meter running, I have the option of either giving him advice on not being an active athlete in this or saying yes to it. Of course, today, even though I expect that the best guys would use PEDs, I would actually not only expect but know that if he reaches a certain level in this sport, he will end up using PEDs. And being a responsible parent, I will probably turn this option down, wouldn't I? I expect most parents to be responsible, and as such, you may have a very big decrease in talent supply for sports. Of course, on the figure on the right here, you could kind of think that the supply curve is rotated to the left, kind of coinciding with the y-axis, leading to a quantity related typically by the x-axis ending up at 0. So there is kind of no sport produced here. This is my main point, and this kind of argument is very absent from this paper. The second and third here is perhaps not that important, but maybe some important. The second says, would public sponsors pay sporting organizations if PEDs are used? I'm questioning that. Today there is public support for sports basically related to positive health effects. Of course, most politicians know and accept that top-level sports is not healthy. However, there is still somebody, at least maybe not enough, who believes that sport at the lower level actually is healthy. So you should kind of encourage the youth to go out and do some sports. That's good for you. Of course, if this good for you is combined with the certainty of using PEDs, then it may be very much harder to persuade the politicians to keep on this flow of money into sports. Finally, there is a question of how the private sponsor would react to it, of course. Maybe not as strong as the public. But if number one turns in here with a kind of degrading activity, then you would also expect that private sponsors will kind of draw themselves out of it. So, roughly, I think it's possible to argue relatively strongly here related to the fact that there is a reasonable chance of a professional sport market breakdown by allowing PEDs or actually making them necessary for athletes or footballers or skiers or whatever. Okay, so what's my conclusion? Yes, it stands here, fight doping with all means. And let me just read the final parts of my paper here. Failing to consider obvious economic effects, both on demand and perhaps especially on the supply side, makes Savaleski and et al.'s arguments somewhat too simplified. I might agree that legalizing PEDs may prove both fairer and safer, but it may very well be that aiming for fairness and safety may lead to a total breakdown of professional sports markets as we see them today. I would not sit still observing this. I love sports, so my medicine would be to do what I tried to state in previous work: increase penalties for drug-taking behavior, make price functions less progressive, and of course increase quality of drug tests. This mid-argument here related to make price functions less progressive is perhaps not easy to see from this talk. I will return to this in a later talk. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this, and please fight doping.